Experience the intimate world of Julius Caesar, March 14th, where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. The steam rose from the marble basin like incense in a temple, wrapping around Caesar's aging body as he descended into the warm embrace of the bath. At 55, his flesh had begun to tell the story of campaigns and conquests, the scar across his ribs from a Gallic spear, the network of smaller marks that mapped his journey from ambitious young senator to master of the known world. The bathhouse, built in the Greek style with its vaulted ceiling and columns of Carrara marble, had become his sanctuary in these final years of triumph. Alexios and 2 other slaves moved like shadows around the periphery, their bare feet silent on the wet stone, preparing oils of lavender and rosemary, laying out clean linens with the reverence of priests tending an altar. Caesar closed his eyes and let his head rest against the smooth marble edge, feeling the heat seep into muscles that had grown stiff from hours in the Senate, from the endless ceremonies that marked his days as dictator perpetuo. The water lapped gently against his chest, and for a moment he could almost forget the weight of empire, the constant calculations of loyalty and betrayal that occupied his waking hours. The marble beneath his fingertips had been quarried from the same hills where Michelangelo would one day seek his stone, though Caesar knew nothing of future artists. He knew only that the surface felt cool against his palm, a contrast to the heated water that embraced the rest of his body. The craftsman who had shaped this bathhouse had understood something about the human need for sanctuary, for spaces where power could be temporarily set aside like armor after battle. Memory drifted through his mind like the steam that rose from the water's surface. He remembered his first campaign in Spain when he had been younger than Brutus was now, when the world had seemed infinite with possibility. The cold rivers where his soldiers had bathed after victories, their laughter echoing off canyon walls, their bodies unmarked by the scars that would accumulate like a catalogue of ambition. The oil lamps flickered in their bronze holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls where frescoes depicted scenes from Homer, Achilles dragging Hector's body around Troy's walls, Odysseus bound to his mast as the sirens sang. How often had he identified with these heroes in his youth, dreaming of glory that would outlast the fragile flesh that contained it. Now, in the privacy of his bath, he could acknowledge what the public Caesar never could, the terrible loneliness of being the man everyone needed but no one truly knew. The frescoes seemed to watch him tonight with particular intensity. Achilles' face, painted by some forgotten artist decades ago, bore an expression that Caesar had never noticed before, not rage or triumph, but something approaching sorrow. The hero dragged his enemy's corpse around the walls of Troy, but his painted eyes seemed to question the price of such victory. When had Caesar last looked upon his enemies with anything but calculation? When had he last felt the weight of another man's death as more than a political necessity? He lifted his hand from the water, watching the droplets fall like tears back into the basin. His fingers, once steady enough to guide a stylus through the most delicate political correspondence, now trembled slightly with fatigue. The hand that had signed death warrants for enemies and pardons for friends, that had accepted the surrender of kings and distributed the wealth of nations, seemed suddenly fragile in the lamplight. The tremor was new, had begun appearing only in recent weeks when he thought no one was watching. In public, he kept his hands clasped behind his back or occupied with scrolls and ceremonial objects. But here, In the solitude of scented water, he could admit to the small betrayals of aging flesh. The physicians spoke of humors and imbalances, prescribed herbs and bloodletting, but Caesar suspected the trembling came from a deeper source, from the accumulated weight of decisions that could never be undone. From beyond the walls of his villa came the muted sounds of Rome settling into evening, vendors calling their final wares, the rumble of carts on stone, the laughter of citizens who lived their lives in the shadow of his decisions. They would sleep tonight without knowing that their emperor lay naked in scented water, as vulnerable as any mortal man, sensing in the March air something indefinable that made his skin prickle despite the bath's warmth. A nightbird called from the gardens, its voice clear and wild in the urban darkness. Caesar found himself listening with unusual attention, as if the creature's song carried some message he needed to understand. When had he last heard a bird sing? When had he last noticed the small beauties that existed beyond the reach of politics and power? The bird called again, and Caesar felt something stir in his chest, not ambition or calculation, but a simpler human longing for connection with the natural world he had conquered, but never truly inhabited. The slaves continued their silent ministrations, and Caesar found himself studying their faces in the flickering light. Alexios with his graying beard and intelligent eyes, the younger ones whose names he had never bothered to learn. They had seen him at his most human, had washed the blood from his wounds after battles, had held his head when fever took him in Gaul. Yet even they maintained the careful distance that power demanded, their devotion as much prison as comfort. The water had begun to cool, its embrace growing less welcoming with each passing moment. Yet Caesar found himself reluctant to rise, to break this spell of solitude and vulnerability. Tomorrow would bring the Senate, would bring the endless performance of leadership that his position demanded. But tonight, in this marble sanctuary, he could simply exist as a man approaching old age, his body marked by time and conflict, his mind heavy with the knowledge that even emperors must eventually surrender to mortality. He would rise soon, would allow them to dry and anoint his body with oils, would don the toga that transformed him back into Caesar the conqueror. But for now, in this moment suspended between day and night, between the public man and the private one, he floated in water that would grow cold, in a peace that could not last, unaware that he was performing this ritual cleansing for the last time. The bronze mirror held Caesar's reflection like a judgment, its polished surface revealing what the cheering crowds in the forum never saw, the deep lines carved by sleepless nights, the way his shoulders had begun to curve inward under the weight of empire. Alexios moved around him with the practiced grace of 15 years' service, each fold of the toga arranged with an intimacy that spoke of countless such mornings and evenings. The bronze itself had been cast in workshops near Brundisium, its surface polished to mirror perfection by craftsmen whose names were lost to history. Yet it held Caesar's image with faithful cruelty, showing not the marble statues that would survive him, but the mortal flesh that time was slowly claiming. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his hair, once as dark as a raven's wing, now bearing the frost of approaching winter. The linen undergarment, woven from the finest Egyptian cotton, settled against Caesar's still damp skin with familiar comfort. He had grown particular about such things in recent years. The thread count of his clothes, the temperature of his wine, the precise arrangement of cushions on his reading couch. These small luxuries, he told himself, were not vanity, but necessary armor against the chaos of ruling an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. Alexios's hands moved with the certainty of long practice, each gesture economical and sure. The slave had learned Caesar's preferences through years of careful observation, how he favored his left shoulder when fatigue set in, the way he unconsciously straightened when preparing to face the world, the small rituals that transformed the private man into the public figure. There was something almost sacred in this daily transformation, like priests preparing a god for worship. "The purple trim tonight, Caesar?" Alexios asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. His Greek accent had softened over the years, but never disappeared entirely, a reminder of his origins in a world where philosophy mattered more than conquest. Caesar nodded, watching in the mirror as skilled hands lifted the heavy wool toga, its white expanse broken by the narrow band of Tyrian purple that marked his rank. The purple had been dyed with murex shells gathered from the waters off Phoenicia, each tiny mollusk sacrificed to create a few drops of the color that spoke of imperial power. Caesar had seen the dye works once during his campaigns in the East, had witnessed the mountains of shells and the vats of precious liquid that cost more than most citizens earned in a lifetime. Now that same purple adorned his clothing, a reminder that his authority rested not just on military might, but on the accumulated wealth of conquered peoples. The ritual of dressing had become a meditation of sorts, each layer adding not just clothing, but identity. The linen that touched his skin, the tunic that covered his scars, the toga that transformed him from man to symbol. Alexios worked in comfortable silence, his movements economical and sure, adjusting the drape across Caesar's left shoulder, ensuring the fold fell precisely to his ankle. In the mirror's depths, Caesar caught glimpses of other mornings, other preparations for public appearances. He remembered the first time he had worn the purple stripe, how the weight of it had seemed both burden and blessing. His mother had been alive then, had watched with proud tears as he prepared for his first major speech in the Senate. She had understood, perhaps better than anyone, the price that public service demanded from those who chose it. In the mirror, Caesar studied not just his own reflection, but the slave who served him. Alexios had been a gift from Pompey in the days when they were still allies, a young man whose education in Athens had made him valuable as both body servant and secretary. Now his beard showed silver, and Caesar realized with something approaching shock that they had grown old together, bound by the strange intimacy that existed between master and slave. The years had changed them both, had carved lines around Alexios's eyes and stooped his shoulders slightly. Yet his hands remained steady, his attention to detail unwavering. Caesar wondered sometimes what thoughts moved behind those intelligent eyes, what judgments the Greek made about the Roman master he served with such apparent devotion. Did he dream of freedom, of returning to Athens, and the philosophical discussions of his youth? Or had servitude become so familiar that liberty would feel like exile? "You're troubled tonight," Alexios observed quietly, his hands never pausing in their work as he arranged the toga's complex folds. It was a liberty that few would dare, but their relationship had evolved beyond the formal boundaries of ownership. Caesar met his eyes in the mirror, seeing there the kind of honest concern that had become increasingly rare in his world. The observation hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither man would voice directly. Alexios had learned to read Caesar's moods like weather patterns, had developed the sensitivity that came from years of proximity to power. He could distinguish between the restlessness that preceded military campaigns and the deeper unease that spoke of threats closer to home. Tonight, something in Caesar's bearing suggested the latter. "The Senate tomorrow," Caesar replied, though that was only part of the truth. There was something else, something that had been building like storm clouds on the horizon of his consciousness. The soothsayer's warning about the Ides of March, dismissed at the time as superstition, now seemed to echo in the marble chambers of his mind. Alexios nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. He had been present at enough political discussions to recognize the signs of brewing conspiracy, had seen how certain senators averted their eyes when Caesar passed, how conversations died when he entered rooms. The slave's position made him nearly invisible to the powerful men who surrounded Caesar, and invisibility, he had learned, was often the best vantage point for seeing truth. Alexios stepped back to assess his work, then moved forward again to adjust the purple stripe that marked Caesar's imperium. His fingers brushed against Caesar's shoulder, and for a moment the touch carried more than professional attention. It held the weight of years, of shared dangers, and quiet confidences. The contact was brief but meaningful, a reminder that even emperors needed human connection, however carefully circumscribed by the demands of power. Caesar felt the warmth of the touch long after Alexios had withdrawn his hand, a small anchor of humanity in the vast sea of political calculation that surrounded him. "The mirror shows more than appearance," Alexios said softly, falling back into the Greek habit of speaking in maxims that had first endeared him to Caesar. "It shows the soul's weather." Caesar looked at his reflection once more, seeing not the conqueror of Gaul or the man who had crossed the Rubicon, but someone older, more fragile than he cared to acknowledge. The bronze surface seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, and for a moment Caesar thought he saw not his current self, but the young man he had been, ambitious and certain, untouched by the compromises that power demanded. That younger Caesar had believed in the possibility of perfect justice, had thought that good intentions could overcome the corruptions of politics. The mirror showed him how naive such beliefs had been, how the pursuit of power inevitably changed those who achieved it. The dressing was complete, the transformation from vulnerable human to imperator accomplished with practiced efficiency. Yet as Caesar turned from the mirror, he carried with him the image of his own eyes, alert but somehow haunted, as if they had seen something in the polished bronze that his conscious mind had not yet grasped. Tomorrow would bring the Senate, would bring decisions that would shape the future of Rome. Tonight, he was simply a man in expensive clothes, attended by another man who understood the loneliness that no amount of purple trim could alleviate. The triclinium's intimate proportions offered Caesar a refuge from the vast public spaces where he spent his days, its 3 dining couches arranged around a low table of African citrus wood, whose grain caught the lamplight like captured sunlight. Papyrus scrolls lay scattered beside his plate like fallen leaves, each one bearing news from the far corners of an empire that never slept. The room itself spoke of understated luxury, its walls painted with frescoes depicting pastoral scenes from the countryside around Rome, shepherds tending flocks, farmers harvesting grain, fishermen casting nets into tranquil waters. These scenes of simple labor provided a counterpoint to the complex machinery of governance that consumed Caesar's waking hours, reminding him of the fundamental human activities that his empire existed to protect and organize. He took a piece of bread, its crust still warm from the kitchen ovens, and dipped it in olive oil pressed from trees that grew on hills overlooking the Bay of Naples. The simple pleasure of taste seemed almost foreign now. When had he last eaten a meal without simultaneously conducting the business of state? A scroll from Gaul lay open beside his wine cup, its contents troubling enough to make the food turn to ash in his mouth. The bread had been baked by Marcus Flavius, the villa's head cook, a man whose artistry with grain and yeast had earned him a reputation throughout Rome. Caesar could taste the wheat's provenance in each bite, grain grown in the fertile plains of Sicily, milled by stones quarried from the same hills that had supplied Rome's temples. Even this simple food carried the weight of empire, representing the vast network of trade and tribute that kept the capital fed. "Unrest among the Helvetii," he murmured to Marcus, the elderly scribe who sat in shadow beyond the lamplight's reach, stylus poised over a wax tablet. "Draft a letter to Labienus, tell him to increase patrols along the Rhine." The familiar sound of writing had become the soundtrack to his private hours, the constant documentation of an empire's needs. Marcus had served 3 generations of Caesar's family, his gnarled hands still steady despite his advanced years. The old scribe remembered Caesar as a boy, had taught him the proper formation of letters and the elegant phrases that marked educated discourse. Now those same hands recorded the commands of the man that boy had become, creating documents that would be copied and dispatched to the furthest reaches of Roman territory. Another scroll, this one sealed with Egyptian wax, bore news of grain shipments and trade disputes in Alexandria. Cleopatra's careful script reported on harvests and harbor improvements, but between the lines, Caesar read the subtext of their complicated relationship, political alliance wrapped in the memory of passion, duty disguised as affection. He had been younger then, in Egypt, young enough to believe that love and power could coexist without destroying each other. The Egyptian papyrus felt different beneath his fingers, smoother than the Roman variety, bearing the subtle perfume of the Nile Delta where it had been harvested. Cleopatra's handwriting was as distinctive as her voice, each letter formed with the precision of someone educated in multiple languages and scripts. Her reports always contained more than their official content suggested, layers of meaning that spoke to their shared understanding of political necessity and personal desire. A slave refilled his cup with wine from Chian grapes, the liquid dark as blood in the lamplight. Caesar held it up, watching how the flame's reflection danced on the surface, and found himself thinking of omens. The soothsayer's words echoed in his mind. "Beware the Ides of March." Tomorrow. The thought sent an unexpected chill through him, despite the brazier's warmth. The wine cup itself was a work of art, crafted by silversmiths in Gaul and decorated with scenes of Bacchus and his followers. The god's face, wreathed in grapevines, seemed to watch Caesar with knowing eyes, as if aware of the irony that the man who had conquered the wine god's homeland now drank from vessels celebrating his mythology. How many such ironies populated his daily life? How many symbols of conquered peoples now served the conqueror? He reached for another scroll, this one from Brutus reporting on judicial proceedings in his absence. The younger man's prose was elegant, educated, carrying the weight of his noble ancestry in every carefully constructed sentence. Caesar had loved Brutus like a son, had seen in him the future of Rome, a leader who could balance the old republic's ideals with the new empire's necessities. Brutus wrote with the clarity of someone trained in rhetoric and philosophy, his arguments structured with the precision of a master debater. Yet beneath the formal language, Caesar detected something else, a tension, perhaps, or a careful distance that had not been present in earlier correspondence. Was it simply the pressure of increased responsibility, or something more troubling? The thought nagged at Caesar as he continued reading. An olive, its flesh bitter and complex, reminded him of the political landscape he navigated daily. Every alliance carried the potential for betrayal, every friendship the seeds of enmity. He had learned this lesson in blood and bronze, in the screams of dying men and the silence of abandoned allies. Yet still he hoped, still believed that loyalty could be earned and maintained through justice and generosity. The olive had been cured in the traditional Roman manner, packed in salt and herbs that drew out its natural bitterness while preserving its essential character. Caesar found a metaphor in this process, how the harsh necessities of politics might preserve what was essential in human nature while transforming what was merely comfortable. Had his own character undergone a similar curing? Had the salt of experience drawn out his youthful idealism while preserving something more durable? To Brutus, he dictated, "Your report on the grain distribution reaches me as I prepare for tomorrow's Senate session. Your efficiency honors your family name." He paused, wanting to say more, to express the paternal pride that political necessity forced him to moderate. Ensure the courts remain accessible to all citizens, regardless of station. Justice delayed is justice denied. The phrase about justice had been one of his father's favorites, a principle that had guided Caesar's own approach to governance. Yet he wondered sometimes whether such ideals could survive the practical demands of ruling an empire. How many times had he delayed justice for political expedience? How many times had he denied it altogether in the name of greater good? The questions haunted his quiet moments, demanding answers he was not sure he possessed. From beyond the villa's walls came the sounds of Rome at evening, the rumble of carts bringing goods from the harbor, the calls of night vendors, the laughter from taverns where citizens debated politics with the passion of men whose opinions carried no weight. How often he envied them their powerlessness, their ability to speak freely without measuring every word's potential consequence. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, its voice joining the urban symphony that surrounded Caesar's island of privilege. He found himself listening to these ordinary sounds with unusual attention, as if they carried messages from a world he had left behind in his climb to power. When had he last walked among common citizens without ceremony or guard? When had he last heard honest opinions unfiltered by political calculation? The correspondence seemed endless tonight, each scroll demanding attention, each decision rippling outward to affect thousands of lives. A report from Spain, a request from Gaul, a complaint from Syria. The empire's needs pressed against him like physical weight, making even this simple meal feel like another duty to be endured rather than a pleasure to be savored. Yet there was something almost meditative about the routine, the steady rhythm of reading, dictating, and deciding that had structured his evenings for years. Each document represented human lives and aspirations, farmers seeking relief from taxation, merchants requesting trade privileges, governors reporting on local conditions. The vast machinery of empire reduced individual concerns to administrative categories, but Caesar tried to remember that behind each petition stood a person whose welfare depended on his decision. The oil lamps flickered as a draft moved through the room, their flames dancing like tiny spirits summoned to witness the empire's business. The light caught the grain of the citrus wood table, highlighting patterns that seemed to shift and flow like water. Caesar found himself staring at these patterns, letting his mind drift away from the demands of governance toward something more fundamental and peaceful. As the last scroll was set aside and the final letter dictated, Caesar found himself alone with his thoughts and the dying flames of the oil lamps. The food had grown cold during his labors, a fitting metaphor for how duty consumed even the most basic human needs. Tomorrow would bring the Senate, would bring decisions that might reshape the very foundations of Roman power. Tonight, he was simply a man eating alone, surrounded by the evidence of an empire's endless hunger for his attention. Calpurnia's approach carried with it the whisper of silk against marble, her movements graceful despite the late hour and the weight of concern that had drawn her from their marriage bed. She bore a silver cup in her hands, steam rising from warmed wine mixed with honey and eastern spices, an offering that spoke of wifely devotion and growing worry. The atrium stretched before her in pools of lamplight and shadow, its painted walls depicting scenes from Homer that Caesar had commissioned in the early days of their marriage. She remembered standing beside him as the artists worked, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as he explained his vision of Odysseus returning home to faithful Penelope. How young they had both been then, how certain that their own story would follow such noble patterns. Caesar looked up from his scrolls as she entered, the lamplight catching the silver threads in her dark hair, revealing the woman who had shared his bed and his burdens for these past years. She was beautiful still, he realized with something approaching surprise, beautiful in the way that Roman matrons were expected to be, dignified, graceful, devoted to home and husband above all else. Yet tonight he saw something else in her face, a gravity that spoke of sleepless nights and unspoken fears. The flames of the oil lamps flickered in the slight breeze that moved through the villa, casting dancing shadows across the scrolls that covered his desk. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called from the gardens, its voice lonely and persistent. The sound reminded him of his childhood in Subura, of nights when his mother would sit by his bed and speak of the dreams that visited great men, dreams that were both blessing and curse. "You'll strain your eyes," she said softly, settling beside his couch with practiced ease. The words were familiar, part of a nightly ritual that had developed over months of his increasing tendency to work late into the evening hours. Her stola, dyed the deep blue of lapis lazuli, pooled around her feet like captured night sky. The fabric was silk from the far reaches of the empire, soft as water and precious as the loyalty of those who served him. He watched as she arranged herself beside him, noting the careful way she moved, the unconscious grace that spoke of years of training in the arts expected of a senator's daughter. Her father had been a careful man, he remembered, one who understood that daughters were currency in the great game of Roman politics. Yet Calpurnia had brought more to their marriage than mere alliance. She had brought a kind of peace he had not expected to find. The cup she offered was warm against his palms, the wine within it carrying the scent of cinnamon and cloves from the distant corners of his empire. "Just a few more," he replied, though they both knew the lie in those words. There were always just a few more letters, a few more decisions, a few more threads in the vast tapestry of governance that demanded his attention. The empire was a living thing, breathing and hungry, requiring constant nourishment of attention and will. The atrium around them held the accumulated silence of centuries, its marble floors worn smooth by generations of Roman feet. His ancestors had walked these halls, had made their own bargains with power and fate. Sometimes, in moments like these, he felt their presence like a weight upon his shoulders, their expectations and their warnings mingling in the lamplight. Calpurnia's eyes, dark as Syrian dates, held the patience of a woman who had learned to compete with an empire for her husband's attention, She had been raised in a senator's house, had understood from childhood that marriage among the great families of Rome was as much political alliance as personal bond. Yet somewhere in the careful choreography of their union, genuine affection had taken root, growing like ivy in the cracks between duty and desire. He studied her face in the lamplight, seeing there the woman who had learned to read his moods, who understood the weight that settled upon him in the dark hours before dawn. She had never asked him to choose between her and his ambitions, had never demanded the impossible. Instead, she had made herself a refuge, a place where he could rest between the battles that defined his days. "The dreams have returned," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of his scroll without disturbing the text. She spoke of the nightmares that had plagued her sleep for weeks now, visions of blood and betrayal, of Caesar falling among the marble columns of the Senate house. He had dismissed them as the product of an anxious mind, but tonight her words carried a weight that made his skin prickle. The air itself seemed to thicken around them, as if the gods were listening to her fears and finding them worthy of attention. The wine cup grew warm in his hands, the metal conducting heat from the liquid within. He breathed in the steam that rose from its surface, tasting cinnamon and honey on the air. His mother had prepared such wine for his father, he remembered, in the days before politics had claimed their family entirely. Those had been simpler times, when the greatest danger was a bad harvest or a neighbor's envy. "Dreams are shadows cast by worry," Caesar replied, though he found himself thinking of the soothsayer's warning, of the strange heaviness that had settled over him like a shroud. He reached out to touch her cheek, feeling the softness of skin that had been protected from sun and wind by the careful life of a Roman lady. Her skin was cool beneath his fingers, smooth as polished marble, yet infinitely more precious. The oil in the lamps burned with a steady flame, casting warm light across the painted walls where gods and heroes enacted their eternal dramas. Achilles pursued Hector around Troy's walls. Aeneas carried his father from burning Troy. Odysseus resisted the siren's call. All stories of men who had faced impossible choices, who had chosen duty over safety, glory over peace. They sat together in the lamplight, husband and wife separated by the vast distance that power created even in the most private moments. She could not truly understand the weight he carried, the constant calculations of loyalty and betrayal that occupied his thoughts. He could not fully explain the loneliness of command, the way absolute power isolated him even from those he loved most. Yet in the space between them, something tender persisted, something that neither ambition nor fear could entirely destroy. A slave's footsteps echoed briefly in the corridor beyond, then faded into the general silence of the sleeping household. The villa around them breathed with the quiet rhythms of night, the settling of timber, the whisper of air through the gardens, the distant murmur of the city beyond their walls. Here, within these walls, they could almost pretend that the world was smaller, more manageable, more kind. She lifted the cup to his lips, the gesture intimate despite its simplicity. The wine was sweet on his tongue, warming him from within as her presence warmed the space around his heart. For these few minutes, he could almost forget the empire that waited beyond these walls, could almost be simply a man with his wife in the quiet of their home. The honey lingered on his palate, mixed with the complex warmth of Eastern spices that spoke of trade routes and distant lands. He watched her face as she waited for him to drink, seeing there the accumulated worry of months, the careful control that kept her fears from overwhelming her composure. She was stronger than she appeared, he realized, stronger than the silk and jewels and careful education suggested. She had learned to love a man who belonged to history, and that required a courage he was only beginning to understand. "Promise me you'll be careful tomorrow," she whispered, her hand finding his among the scattered scrolls. Her fingers were soft, unmarked by labor or weapon, yet they held a strength that surprised him. The strength of a woman who had learned to love a man who belonged as much to history as to her. Her touch was warm against his skin, anchoring him to this moment, to this quiet space where love still lived despite everything that threatened to destroy it. The lamplight flickered once more, casting new shadows across the painted walls where ancient heroes played out their eternal dramas. Tomorrow would bring its own tests, its own choices between safety and glory, between the possible and the necessary. But tonight, in this circle of warm light, with wine sweet on his tongue and his wife's hand in his, time seemed to slow, to offer them this small gift of peace. "I promise," he said, meaning it in the moment, even as part of his mind already turned toward tomorrow's challenges. The Senate would convene, decisions would be made, the machinery of empire would continue its relentless turning. But tonight, in this small circle of lamplight, with wine warm in his belly and his wife's hand in his, Caesar allowed himself to believe that some promises could be kept, that some fears were merely shadows, and that tomorrow would bring nothing more dangerous than the familiar weight of power and the endless necessary burden of ruling the world. The night stretched before them, offering its temporary sanctuary, its brief reprieve from the demands of destiny and the inexorable turning of the wheel of fate. Caesar moved through his private garden like a man walking in a dream he could not quite remember. The marble paths felt cool beneath his bare feet, each step a small shock of clarity in the warm Roman night. Above him, the canopy of his carefully tended trees filtered the moonlight into patterns that shifted and danced with each breath of wind. Sleep had abandoned him completely. He had lain in his chamber for what felt like hours, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into its nightly rhythm. The last calls of merchants, the closing of gates, the soft conversations of his household staff as they prepared for rest. But rest would not come to him. The fountain at the center of his garden spoke in its ancient language of water meeting stone. Caesar paused beside it, watching how the moonlight caught each droplet as it fell from the carved lips of Neptune into the dark pool below. The god's marble eyes seemed to follow him in the shifting light, and Caesar found himself wondering what the sea god might know that he did not. A nightingale called from somewhere beyond the garden walls, its song piercing and sweet in the darkness. Caesar stopped walking, his hand resting on the rough bark of an olive tree his gardeners had coaxed to grow in this enclosed space. The bird's song seemed to carry something more than melody tonight, a warning perhaps, or a lament for something not yet lost. The night-blooming jasmine released its perfume into the air, heavy and intoxicating. Caesar breathed it in, remembering suddenly his mother's garden when he was a boy, how she would walk among her flowers in the evening, teaching him the names of plants and their uses. "Everything in nature has its purpose," she had told him, her voice soft with the wisdom of someone who understood the patterns that governed all living things. He continued his restless circuit of the garden, past the beds of herbs his cook used for the evening meals, past the roses that would bloom again come spring. His sleeping tunic caught on a thorny branch, and as he freed himself, he noticed how his hands trembled slightly. When had that begun? This trembling that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his muscles, as if his very bones were responding to some disturbance in the natural order. From across the city came the sound of the night watch calling the hour. The bronze notes hung in the air long after the bells had fallen silent, and Caesar found himself counting the reverberations, wondering why tonight they seemed to carry such weight, such finality. A stronger breeze moved through the garden, setting the leaves to whispering among themselves. Caesar tilted his head, listening to their conversation, trying to decipher what they might be saying. In Gaul, the Druids claimed they could read the future in the movement of leaves, in the flight patterns of birds, in the way shadows fell across sacred groves. He had dismissed such beliefs as the superstitions of conquered peoples, yet tonight, the fountain continued its eternal conversation with itself, and Caesar approached it again, drawn by its constancy in a world that suddenly seemed less certain than it had that morning. He dipped his fingers into the cool water, watching the ripples spread outward in perfect circles. Each ripple touched the next, creating patterns that grew and intersected and finally faded into stillness. The city around his garden walls seemed more alive than usual for this hour. He could hear voices carrying on the night air, not the usual sounds of revelry or argument, but something more purposeful, more urgent. Groups of men moving through the streets with destinations in mind, their footsteps echoing off the stone buildings in rhythms that spoke of shared purpose. Caesar felt something shift in his chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with the cool night air. He had felt this sensation before, in the moments before battle when the enemy's intentions became clear, when the landscape itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of violence. But there was no enemy here, no battlefield, only his garden, his city, his life proceeding along its appointed course. An owl called from the darkness beyond his walls, its voice hollow and questioning. Caesar found himself answering silently. What indeed? What was this feeling that had driven him from his bed, that made the familiar paths of his garden feel like foreign territory? He walked to the far end of the garden, where a small shrine to the household gods stood among the climbing vines. The oil in the lamp had burned low, casting wavering shadows across the carved faces of the deities who were supposed to protect his family, his home, his future. Caesar reached for the small vessel of oil kept beside the shrine and carefully refilled the lamp, watching as the flame grew stronger, steadier. If there is something I should know, he murmured to the stone faces, his voice barely audible above the garden's night sounds, let it be revealed. The gods, as always, kept their own counsel. The wind picked up again, and Caesar noticed how the shadows seemed to move with more purpose now, as if they were no longer content to simply follow the motion of branches and leaves. He watched one shadow in particular as it stretched across the path before him, noting how it seemed to reach towards something beyond his sight, something that waited in the darkness beyond his garden walls. The nightingale sang once more, its song different now, not the liquid beauty of before, but something more urgent, more warning. Caesar stood perfectly still, every sense alert, trying to understand what the bird was trying to tell him. In the silence that followed its song, he could hear his own heartbeat, steady but somehow too loud in the quiet night. The fountain continued its patient work, but even its voice seemed changed, as if the water itself carried news from distant places, from tomorrow's dawn, from the forum where he would walk in just a few hours to conduct the business of empire. Caesar closed his eyes and tried to imagine that walk, the familiar route from his house to the Senate, the faces of the men who would greet him, the decisions that awaited his attention. But the image would not come clear. Instead, he saw shadows where there should be sunlight, heard whispers where there should be the normal sounds of morning business. He opened his eyes and looked up at the stars, seeking in their ancient patterns some reassurance that the world would continue as it always had. The stars looked back at him with their eternal indifference, beautiful and distant, and utterly without comfort. They had watched the rise and fall of kings, the birth and death of cities, the slow turning of ages that reduced even the greatest human ambitions to dust. What was one man's unease, one sleepless night against such vast and patient time? Yet as the wind moved through his garden once more, Caesar felt that his unease was not without meaning. Something was indeed different about this night, something that went beyond his own restlessness, or the natural anxiety that came with great responsibility. The very air seemed charged with possibility, with change, with the approach of something that would alter the careful balance of his world. He began walking again, but more slowly now, paying attention to each sensation, the cool stones beneath his feet, the jasmine-scented air in his lungs, the way the moonlight caught the edges of leaves and made them seem to glow with their own inner light. If this was to be his last night of walking in this garden, of breathing this air, of being simply Caesar in his private space away from the demands of empire, then he would experience it fully. The night watch called again, and Caesar realized that dawn was still hours away. He could return to his chamber, could lie in his bed and wait for sleep that might never come, or he could remain here among his plants and his fountain and his patient gods, keeping vigil with the night itself. He chose to stay. Moving to a stone bench beside the fountain, Caesar settled himself to wait for whatever the morning might bring, his bare feet in the cool grass, his face turned toward the stars that had watched over Rome since its founding. The fountain whispered its eternal secrets, and gradually, in the rhythm of falling water and the soft stirring of leaves, Caesar found a kind of peace, not the peace of sleep, but the deeper peace of a man who has stopped running from his own intuition and chosen instead to listen to what the darkness might have to teach him. Caesar had not expected visitors this late, yet when Alexios announced that Marcus Brutus waited in the atrium, he felt no surprise. The evening had been filled with unexpected currents, and perhaps it was fitting that it should continue in this vein. He gestured for his young protégé to be brought to the study, that private sanctuary where scrolls of philosophy mingled with military dispatches, where the weight of empire could be set aside for the luxury of thought. When Brutus entered, Caesar noticed immediately that something had shifted in the younger man's bearing. The usual confident stride was replaced by something more hesitant, and his hands, those steady hands that had wielded sword and stylus with equal precision, fidgeted at the edge of his toga. Caesar gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where they had discussed Cicero's latest speeches and the finer points of Stoic philosophy. "You look as though you haven't slept," Caesar observed, offering wine that Brutus declined with a shake of his head. The refusal was another small note in a composition that seemed increasingly discordant. Brutus had never refused wine in this study, where their conversations had ranged from the practical matters of governance to the eternal questions that had occupied philosophers since Athens's golden age. "I wanted to speak with you about tomorrow's Senate session," Brutus said. but his eyes avoided Caesar's direct gaze, focusing instead on the scrolls scattered across the desk. Caesar had learned, through years of reading men's faces across battlefield and forum, that what was not said often carried more weight than words spoken aloud. The way Brutus's shoulders held themselves, the slight tremor in his voice, these spoke of conflicts that ran deeper than legislative concerns. Caesar found himself studying this young man he had come to regard almost as a son, seeing him as if for the first time. The noble bearing that had first caught his attention, the quick intelligence that had made their philosophical discussion such a pleasure, the moral seriousness that had seemed to echo the great Brutus of Republican legend, all of this remained, but underneath lay currents Caesar had not perceived before. "The senators grow restless," Brutus continued, his words carrying careful neutrality. "There are those who question whether the traditional forms are being properly observed." The phrase hung between them, dense with implication. Caesar had heard similar concerns whispered in corridors, seen them in the careful distance some senators maintained when he entered the Curia. "And what do you think, Marcus?" Caesar asked, using the informal address that had become natural between them. "Do you believe I have forgotten the old ways?" The question was genuine, born from a sudden desire to understand how he appeared to this young man whose opinion had come to matter more than he had realized. Brutus's hands stilled their fidgeting, and for a moment his eyes met Caesar's directly. In that brief contact, Caesar glimpsed something that made his chest tighten. Not the admiration he had grown accustomed to seeing there, but something closer to sorrow. "I think," Brutus said carefully, "that power changes even the best of men in ways they cannot always see themselves." The words carried a weight that seemed to surprise even Brutus, who looked away immediately after speaking them. Caesar felt them settle in the space between them like stones dropped into still water. He had expected reassurance, perhaps even flattery, but instead had received something far more valuable and infinitely more troubling: honesty. "You speak as one who has given this considerable thought," Caesar observed, his voice maintaining its gentle tone even as his mind began to work with the tactical precision that had served him in Gaul. The conversation was revealing layers he had not suspected, depths of consideration that suggested Brutus had been wrestling with these questions longer than tonight's visit might suggest. They spoke then of tomorrow's agenda, of the petition regarding the Gallic territories, of the routine business that filled the Senate's days. But underneath the familiar topics, Caesar sensed the presence of something unspoken, a tension that seemed to coil tighter with each carefully neutral exchange. Brutus's responses came too quickly, as if rehearsed, and his eyes continued to avoid the direct contact that had once characterized their discussions. When Brutus finally rose to leave, Caesar remained seated, watching the play of lamplight across features he thought he had known so well. "Marcus," he said, as the younger man reached the door. The single word seemed to carry more weight than intended, and Brutus paused with his hand on the bronze handle. "You seem troubled, my son." The words emerged without conscious thought, and Caesar felt their truth even as he spoke them. The endearment, one he had used before, but never with such conscious awareness, seemed to hang in the air between them. Brutus's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Caesar thought he might turn, might speak the truth that seemed to press against the boundaries of their careful conversation. But the moment passed, and Brutus stepped into the corridor without looking back. Caesar remained alone in his study, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages, yet feeling suddenly that the ground beneath his understanding had shifted in ways he could not yet comprehend. The word son continued to resonate in the silence, carrying implications that seemed to multiply in the lamplight's shifting shadows. He rose and moved to the window that overlooked the forum, where tomorrow's session would unfold according to the ancient forms Brutus had mentioned. The familiar view, the temples and basilicas that had witnessed the rise and fall of so many ambitions, seemed different somehow, as if seen through eyes that had been forced to acknowledge possibilities previously unconsidered. The night air carried the scent of his garden, reminding him of the peace he had found among the olive trees, but that tranquility now seemed as distant as his youth in Subura. The study itself seemed to hold echoes of their conversation, as if the words spoken had somehow altered the very atmosphere of the room. Caesar found himself examining the scrolls on his desk with new attention, seeing in their careful arrangement a kind of order that might soon be disrupted. The treatises on governance, the military histories, the philosophical works, all represented a world where reason and tradition could coexist, where power could be exercised within the bounds of ancient wisdom. Yet Brutus's words had introduced a troubling possibility, that power might indeed change its wielder in ways invisible to the one who held it. Caesar had always prided himself on his self-awareness, his ability to see himself clearly, even as he navigated the treacherous currents of Roman politics. But what if that very certainty was itself a symptom of the transformation Brutus had suggested? What if the man who could see so clearly into the hearts of others had become blind to the changes in his own? The lamp began to gutter, its flame dancing more wildly as the oil ran low. In its flickering light, the familiar objects of his study seemed to take on new significance. The bust of Alexander that had inspired his own ambitions, the maps that chronicled his conquests, the letters from distant provinces that spoke of his growing influence. All of these had once seemed like natural extensions of his abilities and achievements, but now he wondered if they might appear different to eyes less invested in their creation. The wind through the shutters carried with it the sounds of Rome settling into the deep hours of night, the distant call of watchmen, the occasional clatter of late travelers, the whispered conversations of those who conducted their business in darkness. It was a city that never truly slept, and Caesar had always found comfort in that restless energy. Tonight, however, the sounds seemed to carry a different quality, as if the very air had become charged with possibilities he had not previously considered. He moved away from the window and settled once more behind his desk, but found that concentration eluded him. The scrolls that usually provided such pleasure now seemed to mock him with their certainties. Plato's Republic, with its careful balance of wisdom and power, Aristotle's Politics, with its analysis of different forms of government, all of these great works assumed that the reader could stand outside the systems they described, could observe and analyze without being fundamentally changed by the act of observation itself. But what if that assumption was false? What if the very act of wielding power created blind spots that no amount of philosophical training could illuminate? Caesar had always believed that his education, his wide reading, his careful study of history would protect him from the errors that had destroyed other powerful men, yet Brutus's gentle suggestion had opened a crack in that confidence, revealing depths of uncertainty he had not known existed. As the night deepened toward dawn, Caesar found himself facing questions that had no easy answers, confronting the possibility that the young man he regarded as a son might see truths that remained hidden from his own view. The thought was both humbling and terrifying, suggesting that all his careful calculations and philosophical preparations might prove inadequate to the challenges that lay ahead. In the growing silence, he could only wait for morning and wonder what revelations the coming day might bring. Calpurnia lay in the darkness beside her husband, her body still but her mind racing through the fragments of unease that had accumulated throughout this strange day. Caesar's breathing, usually so steady in sleep, carried a restless quality that matched her own wakeful state. She turned carefully, not wanting to disturb him, and studied his profile in the moonlight that streamed through the high windows. The face she knew so well, the strong jaw that had become familiar to every citizen of Rome, the nose that artists struggled to capture in marble, the lines that spoke of campaigns and victories, seemed different in sleep's vulnerability. The public Caesar, master of the known world, had given way to something more fragile, more human. She could see the boy he must have been before ambition and destiny had shaped him into the figure who now dominated the civilized world. But it was not tenderness alone that kept her wakeful. Throughout the evening, she had felt the presence of something indefinable, a quality in the air itself that seemed charged with possibility and threat. Brutus's unexpected visit had unsettled her more than she had admitted, even to herself. The young man's manner had been wrong somehow, too careful, too controlled, like an actor playing a familiar role but struggling to remember his lines. She rose quietly from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cool marble floor. The chamber that had become so familiar over the years of their marriage seemed different in the moonlight, larger, more echoing, as if the shadows themselves had expanded to accommodate secrets she could not name. Moving to the window, she looked out over the city that sprawled beneath them, Rome, in all its complexity and contradiction. The sounds had changed as the night deepened. Earlier, there had been the usual cacophony of a great city, voices raised in laughter or argument, the clatter of wheels on stone, the calls of vendors and the responses of customers. Now, as the hour approached when even Rome's notorious nightlife began to ebb, a different quality had settled over the streets. The silence seemed expectant, as if the city itself was holding its breath. She thought of the soothsayer who had approached Caesar in the market, his warning about the Ides of March echoing in her memory with new significance. At the time, she had dismissed it as the usual collection of portents and prophecies that seemed to multiply around any figure of importance. Rome was full of such voices, claiming divine insight into futures that remained stubbornly opaque to ordinary mortals. But tonight, the memory carried a different weight. "The gods speak through dreams," she whispered to the darkness, remembering her grandmother's words from childhood. The old woman had possessed what the family called the sight, an ability to perceive patterns and possibilities that escaped more rational minds. Calpurnia had inherited something of this gift, though she had learned to keep it carefully hidden in a world that valued masculine logic over feminine intuition. Her own dreams had been troubled lately, filled with images that seemed to carry significance beyond their apparent randomness. Eagles falling from clear skies, their wings broken and their cries echoing across empty forums. Rivers running red beneath bridges where senators gathered in whispered conversation. And always at the center of these visions, Caesar himself, not as the triumphant general or the masterful politician, but as a man isolated by his own elevation, surrounded by figures whose faces remained frustratingly unclear. She moved away from the window, padding silently through chambers that had witnessed the private moments of their marriage. Here, away from the public ceremonies and the constant press of supplicants and advisers, she had seen sides of Caesar that Rome would never know. The man who worried about the welfare of his soldiers, who spent hours reading philosophy, who could be moved to tears by a particularly beautiful piece of poetry. But she had also seen how power had changed him, sometimes in ways so subtle that she wondered if he perceived them himself. The easy confidence of his youth had hardened into something more imperial, more distant. The circle of those he truly trusted had narrowed, and she had watched him become increasingly isolated, even as his influence expanded to encompass the known world. The irony was not lost on her that as Caesar had gained the ability to command legions and reshape the destiny of nations, he had lost something equally precious, the simple human connections that had once nourished his spirit. She thought of Brutus, whom Caesar regarded almost as a son, and wondered what conflicts might lie behind the young man's carefully maintained composure. Returning to the window, she found that the moonlight had shifted, casting new patterns across the familiar landscape of Rome. The Tiber caught and reflected the light in scattered fragments, like broken silver scattered across dark cloth. Beyond the immediate vicinity of their villa, the city stretched away into darkness, punctuated by the occasional torch or oil lamp, each point of light representing lives and stories she would never know. Yet tonight, those unknown lives seemed somehow connected to her own, as if the threads of fate that governed individual destinies had become visible in the moonlight. She felt the weight of history pressing against the present moment, the sense that decisions made in darkness would reshape the world in ways that none of them could fully anticipate. Behind her, Caesar murmured something in his sleep, a name she could not quite catch, or perhaps a word in the Gallic tongue he had learned during his campaigns. She turned to look at him, this man who had become the center around which the civilized world revolved, and felt a sudden fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. The first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern hills, promising an end to this night of unease, and the beginning of what she somehow knew would be a day unlike any other. She remained at the window, watching the light grow stronger, and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, not for victory or glory, but for the simple gift of understanding what the approaching day would bring. The stone beneath her feet had grown cold during her vigil, and she became aware of the way the night air moved through the chamber, carrying with it the scents of the garden below. Jasmine and rosemary mingled with the earthier smells of the city, smoke from countless hearths, the lingering traces of the day's commerce, the eternal presence of the Tiber that had witnessed so much of Rome's history. These familiar fragrances, usually comforting, now seemed to carry messages she could not quite decipher. From the gardens came the soft calls of night birds, their voices weaving patterns in the darkness that seemed almost like a language she had once known but had forgotten. Her grandmother had taught her to listen to such sounds, claiming that the natural world held wisdom that human reason often missed. Tonight, she found herself straining to understand what messages might be carried on the night air, what warnings or reassurances the darkness might offer. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with the cool air. The sense of impending change had grown stronger as the night progressed, until it seemed to press against her consciousness like a physical weight. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones, in the restless energy that made sleep impossible, in the way even familiar objects seemed to hold new significance in the moonlight. The sound of temple bells carried across the city, marking the passage of hours that seemed both eternal and fleeting. She had always found comfort in these regular markers of time, these reminders that Rome continued its ancient rhythms regardless of the ambitions and fears of individuals. But tonight, even these familiar sounds seemed changed, as if they were tolling for something that had not yet come to pass, but was already inevitable. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their villa, she heard the measured tread of the night watch, those faithful guardians who kept their solitary vigil while the city slept. The sound was reassuring in its regularity, a reminder that some things remained constant even when everything else seemed poised for transformation. Yet she wondered if those watchmen, too, felt the strange tension in the air, the sense that this night was different from all the nights that had preceded it. Behind her, Caesar's breathing had grown more regular, suggesting that whatever dreams had troubled his earlier sleep had given way to deeper rest. She envied him that peace, even as she wondered what visions might be visiting him in the realm of sleep. Did the gods speak to him as they had once spoken to her grandmother, offering glimpses of futures that mortal minds could barely comprehend? Or was he simply a man, however extraordinary, facing the same uncertainties that plagued all human hearts? The moon had begun its descent toward the western horizon, and with its movement, the quality of light in the chamber began to change. Shadows that had seemed sharp and definite earlier now blurred at their edges, creating a landscape of half-seen possibilities. In this shifting illumination, she felt as if she stood at the boundary between worlds, between the familiar daylight realm of reason and politics and some other place where different laws applied and different truths held sway. The conspirators had departed into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Brutus alone with the weight of what they had planned and the terrible clarity of what morning would bring. His study, usually a refuge where philosophy could provide answers to life's complexities, now seemed to mock him with its collection of wisdom that had proven inadequate to his present crisis. He moved among the familiar objects, the writing desk his father had used, the shelves lined with works of Plato and Aristotle, the death mask of his ancestor that gazed down with stone eyes that seemed to hold both accusation and expectation. Each item carried memories of the man he had been before tonight's final commitment, before the moment when theory had crystallized into irreversible action. His hands trembled as he poured wine he had no intention of drinking, the amphora's weight seeming to multiply as he lifted it. The simple act of pouring had become complicated, requiring conscious attention to prevent the liquid from spilling across the wooden surface that bore the marks of years of study and contemplation. Everything that had once been automatic now demanded deliberate effort, as if the decision they had reached had fundamentally altered his relationship with the physical world. The faces of his fellow conspirators haunted the shadows cast by the dying lamp. Cassius with his fervent conviction, Casca with his grim determination, Decius with his careful plans for ensuring Caesar's attendance at tomorrow's Senate session. Each man had spoken of duty and necessity, of the Republic's sacred traditions, and the dangers of unchecked power. Their arguments had been compelling, their logic unassailable, yet now, in the silence of his own thoughts, Brutus found himself questioning everything they had so carefully reasoned through. Caesar's face rose unbidden in his memory, not the public Caesar of triumphs and proclamations, but the private man who had called him son with such unconscious affection. The endearment had carried the weight of genuine feeling, the kind of paternal regard that Brutus had never known from his own father, who had died when he was still a child. In Caesar, he had found not just a mentor but something approaching the father he had lost, and now he was preparing to destroy that relationship in the name of principles that seemed increasingly abstract. He moved to the shelf where he kept his copies of Cicero's writings on the Republic, those elegant arguments for the balance of powers and the dangers of autocracy. The words that had once seemed so clear and convincing now felt hollow, as if the gap between theory and practice had revealed itself to be an unbridgeable chasm. It was one thing to discuss the abstract principles of republican government in the safety of philosophical discourse, quite another to implement those principles through violence against a man who had shown him nothing but kindness. He walked to the small shrine where he kept the images of his ancestors, those stern faces that had witnessed the birth and growth of the republic they had all sworn to defend. His great ancestor, the first Brutus, gazed out from marble with the implacable expression of a man who had chosen duty over personal feeling, who had condemned his own sons to death rather than compromise the principles upon which Rome had been founded. That Brutus had become legend precisely because he had proven capable of the kind of sacrifice that lesser men could not contemplate. Yet as he studied that famous face, Brutus found himself wondering whether his ancestor had felt this same crushing weight of doubt in the hours before his moment of historical significance. The histories spoke only of the public act, the dramatic gesture that had saved the Republic from tyranny, but they were silent about the private agony that must have preceded such a choice. Had the first Brutus also spent sleepless nights questioning whether duty and affection could ever be reconciled, or whether the greater good could justify the betrayal of personal trust? The sound of the wind in the garden reminded him of evenings spent in conversation with Caesar, those long discussions that had ranged from military strategy to moral philosophy, from the practical challenges of governing an empire to the eternal questions that had occupied the greatest minds of Greece and Rome. Caesar had been a remarkable teacher, capable of drawing connections between disparate ideas, of illuminating complexities that had previously escaped Brutus's understanding. To lose such a mind seemed not just personally tragic, but a kind of crime against knowledge itself. The lamp began to fail, its flame guttering in the small pool of oil that remained. Brutus watched the light diminish, seeing in its dying flicker a metaphor for something he could not quite name, perhaps the end of innocence, or the moment when philosophical principles collided with the messy realities of human relationships. The approaching darkness seemed appropriate, a fitting accompaniment to thoughts that had grown increasingly somber as the night progressed. In the growing darkness, he found himself remembering a conversation from months earlier when Caesar had spoken about the loneliness of command and the difficulty of maintaining friendships when every relationship carried political implications. "The higher one climbs," Caesar had said, "the thinner the air becomes, and the fewer the companions who can breathe at such altitudes." At the time, Brutus had heard it as a general observation about the nature of power, but now he wondered if Caesar had been speaking more personally, revealing a vulnerability that his public persona never acknowledged. The first pale suggestions of dawn were beginning to appear at the window, promising an end to this night of doubt and the beginning of a day that would reshape everything he had known. Brutus remained seated in his chair, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, yet feeling more alone and uncertain than he had ever felt in his life. The decision had been made, the die cast, Yet he found himself hoping for some sign, some indication that the path they had chosen was indeed the right one. But the gods, if they were listening, remained silent, and Brutus was left to face the approaching dawn with nothing but his own conscience for guidance. In a few hours he would join his fellow conspirators in the Senate House, and the theoretical would become terrifyingly real. Until then, he could only sit in the darkness and contemplate the magnitude of what they were about to do, and wonder whether history would judge them as saviors of the Republic or as the destroyers of something precious that could never be restored. The stone beneath his bare feet had grown cold during his long vigil, and he became aware of the way the night air moved through the shutters, carrying with it the sense of Rome awakening, bakers beginning their work, the smoke from early fires, the subtle shift in the city's rhythm as it prepared for another day. These familiar signs of morning's approach, usually welcome after a night of study, now felt ominous, like the tolling of a bell that marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. The slight breeze stirred the papyrus scrolls on his desk, creating a soft rustling that seemed almost like whispered conversations. He found himself imagining that the great minds of the past were trying to speak to him, offering counsel across the centuries. What would Plato have said about the choice he faced? Would Aristotle have found some middle path between personal loyalty and political necessity? The questions multiplied in the growing light, but the answers remained as elusive as shadows. From beyond his garden walls came the first sounds of the city stirring, the creak of cartwheels, the call of early vendors, the voices of those who began their work before dawn. Rome was waking, unaware that this day would be unlike any other in its long history. The thought filled him with a strange mixture of power and terror. They held in their hands the ability to change the course of empire, yet none of them could predict what consequences would flow from their actions. The last of the oil was consumed, and the lamp flame died with a final flicker, leaving him in the gray half-light of early dawn. The symbolism was not lost on him, the end of illumination, the beginning of a journey into unknown territory where the old certainties would no longer serve as guides. He sat in the growing natural light, feeling the weight of history settling around him, like a cloak he had not chosen to wear, but could not now remove. The first birds began their morning chorus, their voices cutting through the silence with a clarity that seemed almost accusatory. Life continuing its ancient patterns, indifferent to human ambitions and fears. There was something both comforting and terrible in that continuity. The reminder that whatever happened in the Senate House today, the world would continue, the sun would rise and set, the seasons would turn in their eternal cycle. He could hear his household beginning to stir, servants preparing for the day, the quiet efficiency of a well-ordered home. Soon, someone would come to inquire about his needs, to offer food or assistance. How could he explain that what he needed was not breakfast or fresh clothing, but absolution for a choice that seemed both necessary and unforgivable? How could he tell them that the man they served was about to become someone entirely different, shaped by an act that would define the rest of his days? The light grew stronger, revealing the familiar details of his study with merciless clarity. Every object seemed to carry new weight, the stylus he had used to write letters to Caesar, the cup from which they had shared wine, the books they had discussed with such pleasure. All of these would remain after today, but they would be relics of a relationship that would exist only in memory, artifacts of a friendship that had been sacrificed on the altar of principle. Caesar moved slowly through his garden, drawn by an impulse he could not name toward the statues of his ancestors that stood sentinel among the olive trees. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and wet earth, familiar fragrances that had once brought comfort, but now seemed to mock his restlessness with their peaceful constancy. Each step on the gravel path sounded unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness, as if the very stones were announcing his passage to invisible witnesses. The marble faces emerged from shadow as he approached, each statue a reminder of mortality and legacy, of lives that had burned brightly and then faded into memory and stone. His adoptive father gazed down with carved features that seemed both familiar and strange in the uncertain light. The face that had shaped his understanding of duty and ambition, of what it meant to serve Rome while pursuing personal greatness. As he stood before these silent witnesses to his family's history, the events of the night began to coalesce into a pattern he had been reluctant to acknowledge. Brutus's uncomfortable visit, with its careful words and averted eyes. Calpurnia's growing unease, dismissed too easily as feminine superstition. The soothsayer's warning, brushed aside with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself above such concerns. Even Alexios's unusual silence, the way his faithful secretary had seemed to weigh each word before speaking. "They all know something I have chosen not to see," he whispered to the marble faces, his voice barely audible above the fountain's gentle splash. The admission carried a weight that seemed to settle in his chest like a stone. The recognition that his isolation had become so complete that even those closest to him had learned to speak in careful euphemisms rather than risk his displeasure with unwelcome truths. He moved to his adoptive father's statue, remembering the lessons that had shaped his youth, the importance of reading men's faces, of understanding the currents that moved beneath the surface of political life, of recognizing when loyalty had begun to transform into something more dangerous. The old man had warned him that power's greatest peril lay not in the obvious threats of enemies, but in the silence of friends, in the moment when honest counsel gave way to fearful agreement. Yet somehow, despite these early warnings, he had allowed himself to become the kind of leader he had once been taught to fear. The man so elevated that truth could no longer reach him, so powerful that even those who loved him had learned to speak only what he wished to hear. The realization brought with it a profound loneliness, the understanding that he had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a young man, only to discover that success could be its own form of imprisonment. The statues seemed to watch him with expressions that shifted in the uncertain light, now approving, now accusatory, as if his ancestors themselves were divided about what he had become. He thought of the young Caesar who had stood in this same garden years ago, full of ambition and idealism, believing that he could reshape Rome without being reshaped by the process. That young man had been naive about many things, but he had possessed something precious that the older Caesar had somehow lost: the ability to inspire genuine affection rather than mere respect tinged with fear. The olive trees rustled overhead, their leaves catching and releasing moonlight in patterns that seemed to mirror the complexity of his thoughts. These trees had witnessed the rise of his family's fortunes, had provided shade for conversations that had shaped the destiny of the Republic, had stood silent through the transformation of Rome from a city-state to an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. They would continue to grow long after he was gone, their roots drawing sustenance from soil that would eventually claim his own mortal remains. He understood now why sleep had eluded him, why his body had rejected the rest it clearly needed. Some part of him, perhaps the part that had learned to read the subtle signs of political weather during his years in the Forum, had recognized what his conscious mind had refused to acknowledge, that the ground beneath his feet had shifted, that the loyalty he had taken for granted had begun to crack under pressures he had been too proud or too blind to perceive. Moving among the statues, he felt the weight of their accumulated history, the reminder that he was merely the latest in a long line of men who had sought to leave their mark upon the world. Some had succeeded in ways that echoed through the centuries, their names becoming synonymous with greatness or infamy. Others had been forgotten, their ambitions reduced to footnotes in histories that few would ever read. All had faced moments when the future hung in balance, when decisions made in darkness would determine whether they would be remembered as heroes or villains. The fountain's constant music provided a counterpoint to his racing thoughts, its rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, as reliable as the passage of time itself. Water had flowed from this source through seasons of triumph and disaster, through the rise and fall of political fortunes, through the transformation of the Republic into something new and unprecedented. It would continue to flow regardless of what tomorrow brought, indifferent to human ambition and human mortality alike. The first tentative songs of dawn birds began to sound from the olive trees, harbingers of a day that would bring with it the resolution of tensions that had been building for months or perhaps years. Caesar felt the approach of morning not as promise, but as inevitability, the sense that events had been set in motion that could no longer be controlled or redirected. He had become a figure in a drama whose ending had perhaps been written long before he recognized that he was playing a role rather than directing the action. Light began to touch the highest branches of the trees, painting them with the pale gold that preceded sunrise. Soon the city would wake, and he would be expected to resume the role that had become both his glory and his burden, the public Caesar, master of the known world, the man whose word could reshape the destiny of nations. But for these remaining moments of darkness, he could stand among his ancestors and acknowledge what his heart had long understood. He had become what Rome feared most, and in doing so, had set in motion the very forces that would seek to destroy him. The recognition brought not panic, but a strange kind of peace, the clarity that sometimes comes with accepting truth that has been long denied. Whatever tomorrow would bring, he would face it as Caesar, with all that the name implied, its glory and its burden, its triumphs and its inevitable tragic conclusion. Caesar woke not to the sound of his own stirring, but to the awareness that Calpurnia was already awake beside him in the gray light that preceded dawn. Her eyes held a knowledge that matched his own, the terrible clarity that comes when all pretense falls away. She had not slept, he realized, while he had walked the corridors of their home, wrestling with destiny. She had lain here wrestling with the same understanding. There was something almost sacred in this shared vigil, this mutual recognition of what the day would bring. "You know," she said simply, not a question. Her voice carried the weight of a woman who had spent the night moving from fear through denial to a kind of terrible acceptance. Caesar turned toward her, seeing in the growing light how the years had marked her face with lines of worry, most of them earned through loving him. "I know that you know," he replied, "and I know that you have always known, haven't you? Long before last night." She reached for his hand, her fingers cool against his palm. "A wife learns to read the signs," she said. The way senators stop meeting your eyes, the way conversations halt when you enter a room, the way even loyal friends begin to speak of the future in careful, distant terms. Through the high windows of their bedchamber, the first real light of day began to paint the walls in shades of amber and gold. Caesar could hear Rome awakening below, the call of vendors setting up their stalls, the rumble of cartwheels on stone, the everyday symphony of a city that would outlive them all. "You could stay home," Calpurnia said, though her tone held no real hope. "Send word that you are unwell. Let the Senate wait another day." Caesar considered this not from any illusion that it would change what was coming, but from love for her concern. "And tomorrow?" he asked. "Would tomorrow be different? Would Brutus suddenly remember our friendship? Would Cassius discover loyalty? Would the Republic find peace with Caesar's ambition?" She squeezed his hand. "No," she admitted, "but it would give us one more day." The simple honesty of this moved him more than any grand gesture could have. Caesar rose from the bed, moving to the window where the sunrise was beginning to transform Rome into something magnificent and eternal. The city spread before him like a map of everything he had achieved and everything he would leave behind. "A man cannot run from what he has created," he said, watching the light catch the marble columns of distant temples. "I have made myself into something that threatens the Republic. That is the truth they cannot forgive, and it is the truth I cannot unmake." Behind him he heard Calpurnia rise, her bare feet soft on the marble floor. She came to stand beside him at the window, and together they watched Rome wake to what would be its most famous day. "They believe they are saving the Republic," Caesar said. "Perhaps they are right. Perhaps Caesar has become too large for Rome to contain. Perhaps this is how it was always meant to end." Calpurnia's hand found his arm. "And perhaps," she said, "a great man chooses how he meets his fate, rather than letting fate choose for him." This struck him as profoundly true. The choice before him was not whether to go to the Senate. That decision had been made by forces larger than his will. The choice was how to meet what was coming, with dignity or with fear, as Caesar or as a man running from Caesar. A gentle knock at the chamber door announced Alexios, arriving with the formal toga that Caesar would wear to the Senate. Even the slave's eyes, Caesar noticed, carried a weight of knowledge and sorrow that spoke of whispered conversations in the servants' quarters, of rumors that had reached even the lowest levels of the household. As Alexios began to lay out the garments, Caesar found himself studying each piece with unusual attention. The white wool toga with its purple stripe, symbol of his rank and authority. The leather sandals that had carried him across Gaul, across the Rubicon, through the streets of Rome in triumph. Each item felt like part of a ritual preparation, the careful donning of armor for a battle he would not fight, but would certainly lose. "Master," Alexios said quietly, "the litter-bearers are waiting in the courtyard. But they could wait longer, if you wished." Caesar looked at this man who had served him faithfully for 15 years, who had followed him to Gaul and back, who had never once questioned an order or failed in a duty. Even Alexios was offering him an escape he knew Caesar would not take. "No," Caesar said, beginning to dress with deliberate care. "Rome expects Caesar at the Senate today. Rome shall have him." As he dressed, Caesar found himself thinking not of the conspiracy that awaited him, but of the strange peace that had settled over him during the night. All his life he had been driven by ambition, by the need to achieve, to conquer, to become something greater than what he was born to be. Now, for the first time, he felt the peculiar freedom that comes with accepting that the story was ending. Calpurnia helped him with the toga, her fingers skilled from years of this same morning ritual. But today her movements were slower, more careful, as if she were trying to make this ordinary moment last longer than moments were meant to last. "I will remember this," she said suddenly. "This morning, this light, the way you look standing here, ready to face whatever comes." Caesar turned to face her fully, seeing in her eyes the reflection of his own understanding. They had shared 30 years of mornings, but this one felt different. Not just because it might be the last, but because it held within it all the others, all the accumulated weight of a life lived together. "And I will remember," he said, "that you offered me the choice to stay, that even knowing what I am, what I have become, you would have kept me safe if you could." They embraced then, not with passion, but with the deep tenderness of two people who had seen each other clearly and chosen to love what they saw. It was, Caesar realized, perhaps the most honest moment of his adult life. When they separated, the sun had fully risen, filling the chamber with golden light that made everything seem both more beautiful and more temporary. Rome stretched below them in all its magnificent complexity, a city of marble and ambition, of glory and betrayal, of dreams that outlasted the dreamers. Caesar walked once more to the window, looking out over the city that had made him and would now unmake him. Somewhere in those streets, Brutus was perhaps having his own moment of final preparation. Cassius was steeling his resolve. The other conspirators were making their peace with what they believed they had to do, and in a few hours they would all meet in the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was convening. They would speak the words that needed to be spoken, play the roles that history required of them, and transform a political disagreement into legend. "It is time," Alexios said softly from the doorway. Caesar nodded, taking one last look at the chamber where he had spent his final night of life. Everything was exactly as it had always been: the marble floors, the silk hangings, the view of Rome that had greeted him each morning for years. Yet everything was different, transformed by the knowledge that this was an ending. He walked toward the door, Calpurnia beside him, Alexios following at the respectful distance he had maintained for 15 years. As they moved through the corridors of their home, Caesar felt the weight of every step, the significance of each familiar turning. At the entrance to the courtyard, where the litter waited to carry him to his appointment with history, Caesar paused. The sun was fully up now, painting everything in clear, honest light. There were no more shadows to hide in, no more night to postpone what was coming. He had made his choice, not from ignorance or bravery, but from a deeper understanding of what it meant to be Caesar. Some men were born to live long lives in comfortable obscurity. Others were born to burn brightly and briefly, leaving behind light for others to navigate by. Caesar stepped into the litter, settling himself for the journey to the Senate. As the bearers lifted him and began to move through the streets of Rome, he closed his eyes and felt the morning sun warm on his face, carrying him toward whatever waited at the end of this most famous of days. The weight of memory. The lamp flame wavered as Caesar's fingers traced the edges of the campaign map spread before him. Gaul stretched across the parchment in careful lines of ink, each marking a place where men had died under his command. The leather felt soft beneath his touch, worn smooth by years of handling, and he could smell the faint scent of the tannery where it had been prepared, mixed now with olive oil and the mustiness of old documents. The silence of the house wrapped around him like a familiar cloak, broken only by the distant drip of water from the fountain in the atrium and the soft whisper of night wind through the garden's olive trees. These were the hours he treasured most, not the daylight hours filled with petitioners and senators, but these quiet moments when Rome slept, and he could be alone with the accumulated weight of his choices. He reached for a scroll tied with red cord, one of dozens that filled the bronze cylinders lining his study walls. This one bore the seal of a Gallic chieftain's widow, written in careful Latin by a scribe who had learned the conqueror's language. As he unrolled it, her words emerged in the flickering light. "Great Caesar, my husband spoke of you before he died. He said you were a man who understood the weight of command." The parchment crackled softly as he smoothed it flat, the sound sharp in the stillness. The weight of command. How many times had he heard those words, spoken by senators who had never held a sword, by historians who measured glory in territory gained rather than lives lost. But this woman, writing from a burned village that he had ordered rebuilt, seemed to understand something that Rome's marble halls could not contain. His eyes moved to another document, this one bearing the seal of a centurion's mother. The wax had cracked with age, leaving tiny fragments on the desk's polished surface. "My son wrote that you wept when Marcus fell at Alesia," she had written. "I wanted you to know that his death was not in vain if it meant something to you." Caesar remembered Marcus, barely 18, eager to prove himself, cut down by a Gallic spear while trying to plant the legion's standard on the ramparts. He remembered too the boy's face in those final moments, the surprise more than pain, as if death had been the last thing he expected to find on that distant wall. The lamp flame steadied, casting dancing shadows across the scrolls that seemed to move with lives of their own. Each document held a voice, a moment preserved in ink and memory, and together they formed a chorus that only he could hear. The Germanic warrior who had saluted him across the battlefield before their final charge, the Gallic druid who had cursed him in 3 languages, then blessed him in a 4th, the Roman mother who had named her newborn son Gaius Julius in honor of victories she would never fully understand. The study seemed smaller tonight, the walls pressing closer, as if the accumulated weight of all these voices demanded acknowledgement. Maps of Britain, Germania, Egypt, each representing not just conquest, but the countless individual moments of courage and terror that had made such conquests possible. A letter from a Germanic tribal leader, written before their final battle. "You fight with honor, Roman. May the gods judge us both fairly." He could still smell the smoke from that battlefield, still feel the weight of his armor as he had walked among the dead afterward. The Germanic chief had been found with his sword still in his hand, his eyes open to the sky, and Caesar had ordered him buried with full honors. It was a gesture that his own soldiers had not understood, but which had seemed, in that moment, the only possible response to such courage. Caesar set the letter aside and reached for his wine cup, but found it empty. The silence of the house wrapped around him like a shroud, broken only by the distant sound of a night bird calling from the garden. Somewhere in the city, Brutus was probably lying awake too, wrestling with thoughts Caesar could not imagine. The irony was not lost on him, that the man he had loved like a son might be the instrument of his undoing. Another scroll caught his attention, this one from a young tribune who had served in his final Gallic campaign. The papyrus was newer, the ink still dark, and he could almost hear the young man's voice in the carefully formed letters. "I have learned," the young man had written, "that victory and defeat are often separated by the thinnest of margins, and that the gods care little for our plans." The wisdom of youth, Caesar thought, often clearer than the calculations of age. He stood and walked to the window, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern hills. The city lay quiet below him, its citizens still lost in sleep, unaware that their leader was standing here among the remnants of his life's work, finally seeing it clearly. Not the glorious narrative that the historians would write, but the complex tapestry of individual lives touched by his ambition. A cat moved silently across the garden wall, pausing to look up at his window with eyes that reflected the lamplight like small moons. Even the animals of Rome knew him, it seemed, though they asked nothing of him except to be left in peace. How simple their lives were, how free from the burden of choice that had defined his own existence. Returning to his desk, he picked up one final document, a letter he had never sent, written after the crossing of the Rubicon. "To the people of Rome," it began, "I have crossed the river not for personal glory, but because I believed the Republic was in danger." Even then, he had been trying to justify what could not be justified, to make noble what was simply necessary. The words seemed hollow now, written in his own hand, but belonging to a different man, younger, more certain, still believing that intention could somehow sanctify action. He had crossed the Rubicon because he could not bear to be ordinary, because the alternative to greatness had seemed like death itself. But sitting here now, surrounded by the voices of those who had paid the price for his ambition, he wondered if ordinary might not have been enough. The lamp flame steadied, casting its warm glow across the scattered papers. Each document told a story of choice and consequence, of the gap between intention and result. He had set out to save Rome and had perhaps destroyed it instead. He had sought to bring order and had created chaos. He had tried to be a father to Rome's children and had become something else entirely. Yet as he sat there in the growing light, Caesar felt something unexpected. Not regret exactly, but a kind of peaceful recognition. These papers, these voices from across the years, they were not accusations, but simply the truth of what had been. The Gallic widow who thanked him for rebuilding her village, the mother who found comfort in knowing her son's death had meaning, the Germanic chief who acknowledged honor even in defeat. He began to roll up the maps, his movements slow and deliberate. Each scroll returned to its place, carried with it a life, a moment, a choice that had rippled outward into consequences he could never have foreseen. This was what it meant to have lived fully, not to have avoided mistakes, but to have made them with conviction and to face their weight without flinching. The study grew brighter as dawn approached, and with the light came a strange sense of completion. Whatever this day brought, he would meet it as he had met all the others, as a man who had chosen action over safety, who had risked everything for a vision that might have been flawed but was entirely his own. Outside, he could hear Alexios moving quietly through the house, beginning the rituals that would prepare them both for whatever the Senate would bring. Caesar gathered the last of the scrolls, his fingers lingering on each one as if saying farewell to old friends, and felt ready finally to face the day. Alexios remembers. The darkness before dawn held a particular quality that Alexios had learned to recognize over the years, not the heavy darkness of midnight, but the expectant darkness that knew its time was ending. He moved through Caesar's bedchamber with the silent precision of long service, his bare feet finding their way across the familiar tiles without need of light. The bronze clasps of Caesar's formal toga clinked softly as he arranged them on the carved chest, each piece placed exactly where it had been placed 1,000 mornings before. Yet something was different today, not in the routine itself, but in the weight of it, as if each familiar gesture carried more significance than usual. The room held the accumulated scent of years, cedar from the clothes chests, the faint trace of Egyptian incense that Caesar preferred, the lingering warmth of olive oil from the lamps. These smells had become the architecture of Alexios's world, as familiar as his own breath, yet tonight they seemed to carry an undertone of finality that made him pause in his preparations. He had served Caesar for nearly 20 years, since the days when the general was still young enough to leap onto his horse without wincing, when his hair was dark and his laugh came easily. Alexios remembered the first time he had seen his master weep, not from pain or frustration, but from the simple human weight of command. It was after the news of Crassus's death had reached them in Gaul, and Caesar had dismissed everyone from his tent except for his body slave. "He was the best of us," Caesar had said that night, his voice breaking slightly. "The best of us, and now he's feeding the crows in some Syrian desert." Alexios had said nothing. What comfort could a slave offer to a general? But he had stayed close, ready with wine or water, or simply the presence of someone who would ask no questions. The memory was so clear that Alexios could still smell the leather of that campaign tent, still feel the rough wool of the blanket he had wrapped around Caesar's shoulders as the night grew cold. Those had been simpler times, in their way. The enemy was always in front of them, the objectives clear, the bonds between men forged in the honesty of shared danger. Now, as he smoothed the folds of the white wool that would drape Caesar's shoulders in the Senate, Alexios found himself remembering all the private moments that Rome would never know. The way Caesar still flinched when thunder rolled too close, a remnant of some long-ago battle. How he talked in his sleep, calling out names of men who had died under his command. The careful way he moved his left shoulder on damp mornings, favoring an old wound that had never quite healed. The first drops of morning dew were beginning to form on the window glass, each one catching what little light filtered through the shutters. Alexios had always found comfort in these small signs of the world's continuance, the way flowers opened regardless of human ambition, the way birds sang without concern for the rise and fall of empires. These were the truths that mattered, Alexios thought. Not the public ceremonies or the grand speeches, but the small human details that revealed the man beneath the legend. Caesar's fear of being alone, which had led him to keep scribes and advisors close even when he had no need of their services. His habit of reading letters from common soldiers long into the night, as if their words could anchor him to something real. There was the way Caesar's hands shook slightly when he was truly tired, though he would never admit to weakness in front of others. The careful ritual he performed each morning, touching the small bronze amulet his mother had given him before his first campaign. The way he always paused at doorways, as if gathering himself for whatever performance the day would require. The first birds were beginning to call from the garden as Alexios lifted the heavy purple-striped toga from its cedar chest. The fabric held the scent of the wood and the faint trace of the Egyptian incense that Caesar preferred. Each fold had to be perfect, not from vanity, but because the Senate would notice any flaw and interpret it as weakness or disrespect. Yet as he worked, Alexios felt an unusual heaviness in his chest. He had learned to read his master's moods like a sailor reads the sky, and lately there had been signs that troubled him. Caesar's restlessness, his long silences, the way he sometimes stared at nothing as if seeing visions that others could not share. Last night, Alexios had heard him moving about in his study until nearly dawn, the soft sound of scrolls being unrolled and rolled again, the creak of the chair as Caesar shifted his weight. There had been something final in those sounds, though Alexios could not say why he felt this way. Perhaps it was simply the accumulation of small changes, the way Caesar had embraced Brutus a moment longer than usual at yesterday's dinner, the careful attention he had paid to Calpurnia's words, as if memorizing them. The leather belt that would hold the toga in place was worn smooth from years of use, its bronze buckle polished to a warm glow. Alexios checked each element of the costume with the thoroughness of a priest preparing for sacrifice. The ceremonial dagger that Caesar would wear, more ornament than weapon, but required by tradition. The signet ring that bore the seal of his authority, the laurel wreath that would crown his head when he entered the Senate house. Through the shutters came the sound of the city beginning to wake, the distant call of vendors setting up their stalls, the creak of cart wheels on stone, the murmur of early conversations. Rome was stirring, preparing for another day of the endless drama that was politics and power, unaware that in this quiet room a slave was dressing the man who had become its master. He remembered when Caesar had first received that wreath after his triumph in Gaul, how young he had seemed then, despite his years, how surprised by the weight of gold leaves against his temples. "It's heavier than I expected," he had said to Alexios with a rueful smile. "I suppose that's the point." Now the wreath sat in its place of honor, the gold dimmed slightly by time but still magnificent. Alexios lifted it carefully, feeling the delicate craftsmanship in each leaf, each vein traced by the goldsmith's careful hand. This would be among the last things he placed on his master's head, the final element in the transformation from private man to public figure. The weight of it surprised him. Not its physical weight, which he knew well, but the symbolic burden it represented. Each golden leaf was a victory, a conquest, a moment when Caesar had stood before the cheering crowds and accepted their adoration. But it was also the sum of all those private moments of doubt and weariness that only Alexios had witnessed. If he could, Alexios would have kept Caesar safe in this room forever, away from the Senate's scheming and the people's fickle love. Here, in the quiet darkness before dawn, his master was simply a man who needed care and understanding, not the godlike figure that Rome demanded. But Alexios was only a slave, and slaves did not choose their master's destinies. The sound of movement from the study told him that Caesar was stirring, probably rising from the chair where he had spent the night among his maps and memories. Soon he would call for Alexios to begin the morning rituals, the washing, the dressing, the careful arrangement of each element that would present Julius Caesar to the world. As Alexios made his last preparations, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the toga's fold, he found himself offering a silent prayer to whatever gods might listen. Not for victory or glory, those were beyond his power to grant, but simply that his master might find peace in whatever this day would bring. It was all that love could offer, in the end, the hope that those we serve might find their rest. The eastern window was beginning to show the first true light of day, and with it came the familiar sound of Caesar's footsteps crossing the study floor. Alexios straightened the last fold of fabric and prepared to begin another day in the service of the man who had become, over the years, both master and, in his way, friend. In the growing light, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls understood that this morning was different from all the others that had come before. Alexios felt it too, a sense of completion, of circles closing, of stories reaching their natural end. Whatever the day would bring, he would face it, as he had faced all the others, with quiet competence, unwavering loyalty, and the deep satisfaction that comes from serving something larger than oneself. Calpurnia's dawn. The garden held its breath in the moments before sunrise, and Calpurnia moved among her plants with the quiet grace of long habit. The clay amphora felt cool in her hands as she poured water onto the roots of the jasmine that climbed the eastern wall, watching the dark earth drink deeply of what she offered. She had risen early, drawn from sleep not by dreams this time, but by a strange sense of completion, as if some long-held tension in her body had finally released. The nightmares that had plagued her for weeks seemed distant now, their urgent warnings replaced by something deeper and more accepting. What would come, and her role was not to prevent it, but to tend what could be tended. The roses along the southern border were beginning to show their morning faces, petals still heavy with dew that caught the first rays of light like scattered diamonds. Calpurnia dead-headed the spent blooms with careful fingers, each cut precise and clean. There was wisdom in this work, she had learned, knowing when to hold on and when to let go, understanding that beauty often required the courage to remove what was finished. A blackbird called from the olive tree that shaded her herb garden, its song clear and liquid in the morning air. She paused in her work to listen, remembering how her mother had taught her to read omens in bird flight and weather patterns. But this morning she felt no need for signs or portents. The truth was simpler than augury. Some things were beyond human control, and peace came from accepting this rather than fighting it. The fountain in the garden's center provided a constant, gentle murmur as water fell from the bronze figure of Diana into the marble basin below. Calpurnia had chosen this goddess deliberately when she designed the garden, not Venus with her promises of passion, or Juno with her demands for loyalty, but Diana the huntress, who belonged to herself alone and answered to no one's expectations. She had tried, in the early years of her marriage, to be the kind of wife she thought Caesar needed, decorative, compliant, content to live in the reflection of his glory. But gradually, she had learned that what he valued most in her was precisely what she had tried to suppress: her independence, her quiet strength, her ability to see clearly without the distortion of ambition or fear. The herbs released their morning fragrances as she moved among them: rosemary for remembrance, lavender for peace, mint that would flavor the evening meal. Each plant had its purpose, its season, its particular needs. Like people, she thought, they flourished when given what they required, and withered when forced into roles that did not suit their nature. She had learned to read Caesar's face as carefully as she read her garden, noting the small signs that revealed his inner weather. The way his left eye twitched when he was truly worried, despite his public calm, how his hands moved restlessly when he was working through a problem that had no clear solution, the particular quality of silence that meant he was remembering the dead. Last night she had seen all these signs and more, but she had not pressed him with questions or pleas. Love, she had discovered, was not always about protection. Sometimes it was about bearing witness, about being present without trying to change what could not be changed. She could not save Caesar from his destiny any more than she could prevent winter from following autumn. The light grew stronger as she worked, warming the stone paths and bringing color to the spaces she had created as her sanctuary. Here, surrounded by growing things and the gentle sound of water, she could remember who she had been before she became Caesar's wife and who she would remain after, whatever came next. The dreams had shown her blood and betrayal, the Senate floor slick with violence, but they had also shown her something else. That grief, like joy, was temporary, and that life continued in forms both expected and surprising. The garden would bloom again next spring, whether she was there to tend it or not. The fountain would continue its gentle song. The blackbird would return to the olive tree and teach its young the ancient melodies. She knelt beside the bed of violets that grew in the shade of the garden wall, their purple faces turned toward whatever light they could find. These were her favorites, perhaps because they asked for so little: a bit of moisture, protection from the harsh sun, soil that was neither too rich nor too poor. They bloomed quietly, without fanfare, offering their small beauty to anyone who took the time to notice. As she worked, Calpurnia felt the last of her resistance drain away like water into thirsty earth. She had spent months trying to hold back the tide of fate through worry and warning, but now she understood that her true power lay elsewhere. Not in preventing what must happen, but in meeting it with grace, not in protecting Caesar from his choices, but in loving him fully while those choices played out. The sun cleared the eastern wall, flooding the garden with golden light that transformed the ordinary morning into something luminous. Calpurnia rose from her knees and brushed the earth from her hands, feeling the satisfying ache of work well done. The plants were watered, the spent blooms removed, the small disorders of the night set right. Soon Caesar would emerge from the house in his formal toga, ready to face whatever the Senate would bring. She would kiss him goodbye, as she always did, and he would promise to return for the evening meal. Whether that promise could be kept was not for her to know, but the kiss would be real, and the love behind it would endure regardless of what followed. The garden held its peace around her as she gathered her tools, and Calpurnia carried that peace with her as she turned toward the house where her husband was beginning his preparations for the day. In the end, this was enough: to have loved fully, to have tended faithfully, and to trust that some things were larger than any individual will, even Caesar's. The Senate toga. Caesar stood motionless in the center of his dressing chamber as Alexios approached with the formal toga, the heavy white wool draped across his servant's arms like a ritual offering. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the fabric's weave, revealing the careful craftsmanship that marked it as suitable for Rome's highest office. "The wool is from Tarentum," Alexios said softly. Though they both knew this, it was part of their morning ritual, the small comments that made the transformation from private man to public figure feel less like a burial shroud. Caesar raised his arms slightly, allowing the fabric to be arranged around his shoulders with the precision of long practice. The weight settled across his body like familiar armor, though armor it was not. This morning the toga felt different. Not the protection he had once imagined it to be, but simply cloth, that would serve its purpose for whatever time remained. The purple stripe that marked his rank caught the light as Alexios adjusted the drape, each fold falling into place with the inevitability of fate itself. "Shall I add the extra pin at the shoulder?" Alexios asked, his fingers already reaching for the bronze clasp that would ensure the toga stayed in place during long speeches. But Caesar shook his head slightly. If the fabric chose to slip, let it slip. There was something liberating in the thought of facing the Senate without the full armor of ceremony. As Alexios worked, Caesar caught sight of himself in the polished bronze mirror that stood against the far wall. The man looking back at him was neither the young general who had crossed the Rubicon, nor the godlike figure that Rome's artists loved to sculpt. He was simply a man of middle years, his hair silver at the temples, his face marked by the accumulated weight of choices made and consequences accepted. "The laurel wreath, Caesar?" Alexios held the golden circlet that would complete the formal costume, its leaves catching the morning light like small flames. Caesar considered refusing this too. What need did he have for symbols of victory when the day might bring something else entirely? But habit and courtesy won out, and he lowered his head to receive the crown. The gold felt surprisingly light against his temples, though he remembered when it had seemed to weigh more than a legionnaire's helmet. Time had taught him that symbols meant only what those who wore them chose to make them mean. Today, the wreath would be simply what it was, metal shaped by human hands, no more or less significant than the man who wore it. "Your signet ring, Caesar." Alexios slipped the heavy gold band onto Caesar's finger, the carved seal that bore his authority in its design. This, at least, felt substantial, not because of its symbolic weight, but because of the countless documents it had sealed, the orders that had shaped the lives of millions. Whatever else might be said of him, he had not wielded power carelessly. The ceremonial dagger came next, more ornament than weapon, its bronze hilt worn smooth by generations of senators who had carried it before him. How strange that the Senate required its members to come armed to deliberate peace, Caesar thought. But then, Rome had always been a city that understood the relationship between violence and order, even if it preferred not to speak of it directly. Alexios stepped back to survey his work, his practiced eye checking each element of the costume for flaws that might be interpreted as disrespect or weakness. "You look as a Caesar should," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice, not quite farewell but close to it, that made Caesar study his servant's face more carefully. "You have served me well, Alexios," Caesar said, and saw the slight widening of the other man's eyes at this unexpected acknowledgement. "Whatever this day brings, remember that you have been more than a servant. You have been a witness to the man behind the office, and that is a gift I do not take lightly." Alexios bowed his head, but not before Caesar caught the gleam of tears in his eyes. They both knew that something was ending, though neither could say exactly what. The mourning rituals that had bound them together for 20 years felt different today, charged with a significance that had nothing to do with togas or laurel wreaths. Caesar moved to the window that looked out over the city, his toga rustling softly with each step. Rome spread below him in the growing light, the forum where he would soon speak, the temples where citizens offered prayers to gods who might or might not be listening, the houses where ordinary people were beginning their ordinary days. "They will remember the speeches," he said, half to himself and half to Alexios. "The grand gestures, the public moments. But you and I know that the real man lived in the spaces between those moments, in the quiet conversations, the private doubts, the small kindnesses that history never records. He turned from the window and faced his reflection one final time. The white wool, the golden wreath, the bronze ornaments, all of it would serve its purpose today, would play its role in whatever drama the Senate had prepared. But beneath the costume was simply a man who had lived fully, loved imperfectly, and made choices that would echo long after the echoes of his voice had faded. "Shall I call for the litter?" Alexios asked. Though they both knew the answer, Caesar always walked to the Senate when weather permitted, preferring the direct contact with Rome's streets to the isolation of a carried chair. "No," Caesar said, adjusting the toga's fold across his chest with his own hands. "I will walk, as I always have. Let Rome see her Caesar as he is, neither more nor less than what the day requires." The morning light had grown strong enough to warm the stone floors, and somewhere in the house Calpurnia was moving through her own rituals of preparation. Whatever farewells needed to be spoken would be spoken. Whatever embraces were required would be given. And then he would walk through Rome's streets one more time, carrying himself with the dignity that the office demanded and the peace that he had finally found. The toga settled around his shoulders like the weight of years, and Caesar felt ready at last to meet whatever the day would bring. The morning light came slowly, as it always did, filtering through the leaves of the olive trees that Caesar had planted in the first years of his marriage to Calpurnia. He had risen before dawn, as was his habit, not from restlessness but from a deep desire to walk through his garden in these quiet hours when Rome still slept, and the world belonged only to him and the growing things he had tended. His sandals made barely a whisper against the worn marble of the garden path, stones that had been polished smooth by years of his daily walks. The fountain at the garden's heart was already catching the early light, each droplet of water becoming a small prism that scattered rainbow fragments across the surface of the pool below. He paused there, as he had paused there countless mornings before, watching the water rise and fall in its eternal rhythm. The roses that Calpurnia had planted along the eastern wall were heavy with morning dew, their petals still closed against the cool air, but beginning to stir with the promise of warmth to come. Caesar reached out to touch one of the buds, feeling its tight perfection, the way it held within itself all the beauty it would soon release. These were the moments he treasured most, not the roar of the crowds in the forum or the weight of the laurel crown upon his head, but this simple communion with life in its most essential form. A blackbird called from somewhere in the cypress trees that bordered the garden's northern edge, and another answered from the direction of the house. The sound was clear and liquid in the still air, a music that belonged to no human composition, but spoke nonetheless of harmony, of the rightness of things as they were. Caesar smiled, remembering how Calpurnia had delighted in identifying each bird's song when they had first moved to this house, how she would wake him in the early morning to listen to some new arrival in their small sanctuary. He walked on, following the familiar circuit that had become as natural to him as breathing. Here was the vine he had planted with his own hands 15 years ago, now thick as a man's arm and heavy with the promise of grapes that would ripen in the autumn he might not see. The thought came to him without fear or sadness, simply as a fact to be acknowledged, like the color of the morning sky or the scent of jasmine that drifted from the trellis near the garden wall. The bees were already at work among the lavender bushes, their bodies heavy with pollen as they moved from flower to flower in their ancient dance of gathering and giving. Caesar watched them for a long moment, struck by their purposefulness, their complete absorption in the task at hand. They knew nothing of empires or ambitions, of the weight of history or the burden of choice. They simply were, and in their being, they fulfilled something essential and beautiful. The path curved past a small grove of lemon trees, their branches heavy with fruit that glowed like captured sunlight in the growing day. Calpurnia had insisted on these trees, saying that their scent would remind her of her childhood home in the south. Now their fragrance filled the air with sweetness, and Caesar found himself thinking not of conquest or glory, but of the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with his wife beneath these same branches. The taste of honey and bread and wine blessed by the presence of someone who loved him not for what he had achieved, but for who he was in the quiet moments between achievements. The fountain's music followed him as he walked, a constant gentle murmur that had become the soundtrack to his most private thoughts. How many decisions had he made while walking this path? How many letters had he composed in his mind while watching the play of light on water? The garden had been witness to all of it, his doubts and certainties, his moments of triumph, and his hours of questioning. Near the garden's eastern boundary, where the morning sun struck most directly, stood a single pomegranate tree that had been here when they first came to the house. Its trunk was gnarled with age, its bark scarred by seasons of growth and dormancy, yet each spring it produced new leaves, new flowers, new fruit. Caesar placed his palm against its rough surface, feeling the life that pulsed beneath, the slow, steady heartbeat of something that had endured longer than any human ambition. A cat appeared from behind the herb garden, one of the strays that Calpurnia fed despite his mock protests about the expense. It regarded him with the serene indifference that only cats could manage, then began to groom itself in a patch of sunlight, utterly content with its small domain. Caesar envied that contentment, that ability to find perfect satisfaction in the warmth of sun on fur, in the simple fact of being alive in this moment and no other. The air was warming now, and he could hear the first sounds of the city stirring beyond the garden walls, the creak of cartwheels on stone, the distant call of vendors beginning their daily rounds, the gradual awakening of Rome to another day of its eternal life. Soon he would need to join that larger world, to take up again the role that history had assigned him. But not yet. For now he was simply a man in his garden, surrounded by the things he had planted and tended and loved. He came to the bench where he and Calpurnia often sat in the evenings, watching the shadows lengthen and the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The marble was still cool from the night, and he settled onto it for a moment, looking back across the garden he had created. Every plant, every stone, every carefully planned vista spoke of choices made with love and attention, of a life lived not only in the grand gestures that would fill the history books, but in the small daily acts of cultivation and care. The garden was fully awake now, alive with the business of growing things. Butterflies danced among the flowering herbs, their wings catching and releasing the light in patterns too beautiful for any human art to capture. Somewhere a dove cooed softly, and the sound seemed to come from the very heart of peace itself. Caesar rose from the bench and continued his walk, knowing that this circuit was drawing to its close. At the garden's far end, where the path curved back toward the house, he paused once more to look back at what he was leaving. The fountain sparkled in the full morning light now, the roses were beginning to open their faces to the sun, and the whole small world he had made hummed with quiet life. He thought of all the mornings he had walked this path, all the seasons he had watched unfold in this protected space. Spring mornings when everything burst with new growth, Summer days when the air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine, autumn afternoons when the leaves turned gold and red before falling to carpet the paths, winter mornings when frost outlined every branch in crystal. Each season had brought its own gifts, its own lessons in the rhythms of growth and rest, abundance and dormancy. A breeze stirred the olive trees, and their leaves whispered secrets that only they knew, stories of roots that reached deep into Roman soil, of branches that had weathered storms and drought, and the passage of years beyond counting. Caesar listened to their whispered wisdom and felt something settle in his chest, a quietness that was deeper than peace, more complete than contentment. He walked the final steps to where the garden path met the broader way that led to the house's main entrance. Here, at the threshold between his private world and the public realm that awaited him, he turned back once more. The garden lay before him in the full glory of morning, every detail sharp and clear in the golden light. The fountain's dancing water, the roses heavy with dew, the ancient pomegranate tree standing sentinel over it all. This was what he would carry with him into whatever the day might bring, not the weight of empire or the burden of choice, but this simple knowledge of what it meant to tend something with love, to create beauty in a small space, to find in the daily miracle of growing things a peace that no triumph could equal and no defeat could destroy. From somewhere in the city came the sound of the morning prayers, the ancient rhythms that marked the hours of Roman life. Soon the streets would be full of citizens going about their business, senators gathering for debate, soldiers preparing for their duties. The great machinery of empire would turn as it always turned, and he would take his place within it as he always had. But first, this moment of perfect stillness, this last long look at the garden that had been his truest home. The bees continued their work among the flowers, the fountain sang its eternal song, and somewhere in the cypress trees a bird called out with pure joy at the gift of another morning. In all of this, Caesar found a completion that felt like benediction, a sense that whatever came next, he had lived fully in the small daily choices that made a life. He turned then toward the house, toward Calpurnia and breakfast, and the duties that awaited, carrying within himself the garden's peace like a blessing. His footsteps were unhurried, his breathing calm, his heart settled in the deep quiet that comes to those who have learned to find the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the daily round of tending and growing, and simply being present to the gift of life itself. Behind him, the garden continued its ancient work of blooming and growing, holding within its boundaries all the patient wisdom of things that know how to endure, how to find joy in the simple fact of existence, how to offer beauty freely to any who pause long enough to receive it. Join us for more quiet moments from history, where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest.